Welcome to Magic in the Middle. I'm Sarah Adams Mar-Dumont. This is a space to pause, to find clarity, and explore where science and spirituality meet so life feels lighter and more aligned and you're thriving. Episodes drop every Monday. I invite you to take this journey with me to discover the magic in the middle. Hi, Mike. Welcome
Hi.
to Magic in the Middle. I'm so happy to have you here. Um, so everybody, I'm here with Mike Rucker from The Fun Habit, and I have to tell you a fun story. So I've been reading The Fun Habit. I love it, and I was like, I have to see if I can reach Mike Rucker to be on the Magic in the Middle for an interview. So it's a couple weeks go by, and I haven't heard, and I think it followed up and stuff, which isn't unusual. I mean, people are busy or like, who's this person? Mike gets back to me and says, "Oh, hey Sarah, I looked you up on LinkedIn and we went to Chapman together, and Dan Leonard is one of my favorite professors from Chapman Film School, which was a really tiny school at the time. Everybody, I have to tell you, this school was so small. Um, and I was like, what are the freaking odds? And I think we graduated the same year, right, Mike?
99, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So wild.
It was such a trip. I was like, that is so cool, this energy. And I gotta say, Dan Leonard, he is just one of the best teachers ever. He's so kind. He pushes you to stretch. But he's just really clever too. And a great musician like you.
Yeah, well, he is a great musician. I'm a musician, or was, I suppose. But we both play bass, so we have that. Yeah,
Yeah, in common. Yeah.
yeah,
So like I said, Mike wrote The Fun Habit, which is an amazing book, and it really opened up a lot for me in my life. And as we're talking through this, I'll be talking about that. But I really do encourage people to grab this book because it's so good. So, um, I want to open with what led you to study fun as something serious, meaningful, and deeply connected to how we live?
yeah. So the roots in that are that I had an interest in positive psychology early on, and that led to some serendipity where I got invited to kind of be part of the broader conversation early on and was invited to join the International Positive Psychology Association. And back then, because we weren't really looking at happiness as this construct, that's what we focused on, right? And so I guess to take one step back for folks that don't even know what positive psychology is, the term was coined because in regular psychology, academic psychology, we have tools that anyone can use for their own betterment, things like mindfulness and gratitude, which I think we sort of generally understand now, 20 years later. But back at the turn of the millennium, we weren't really talking about those things except in the context of poor mental health, tools that could help folks, if they had some sort of problem to treat. And so positive psychology was like, why don't we make these tools accessible to everyone? And that really resonated with me because I've always been into life logging and like, how can you optimize yourself? And as my interests started to grow, I got more involved as, a practitioner of these and studied them academically. But something interesting happened around, after 10 years of kind of talking about it openly and getting people to sort of think about what happiness means to them. Research started to come out that paradoxically, as we made, put happiness up on this pedestal and made it this ideal, like this thing to strive for, paradoxically, we were making some of the most unhappy people. And
Mm.
so we've come to find out, right, that if, you know, it is really meant to be ephemeral, but if we're always trying to chase it or we're trying to optimize for it because it does ebb and flow, it really does create these problems, especially if it's something we can't maintain every day, which is certainly all of us, right? I mean, we're all going to get slings and arrows thrown at us. And I certainly did. I know you asked if I would be open to talk about it, but as I was going through this process, and quite frankly, like getting the deck stacked in my favor, I was, having a really good run, in life. I had the job I wanted, married an amazing woman, Was an amateur athlete, so it wasn't like I was competing, but I was, liked where my body and mind were at. And then all of a sudden, around 2016, 2017, a bunch of things just kind of knocked me down. One was I lost my younger brother quite suddenly to a pulmonary embolism. And then two, I found out that I likely had a sports injury that went undiagnosed. It was a torn labrum, but because I didn't repair it, it had essentially ate itself. And then I was going to need a hip replacement. And when you get a hip replacement in your 40s, you're essentially told that you shouldn't run again. You can if you want, but it's ill advised because you'll have to get a revision at some point, and that some points like in your 60s or 70s, and revisions generally don't go very well. You'll walk with a limp at that point. So they really encourage you to do other types of exercise. And why that's important is my identity was running. I like triathlons, but the fun part for me, and I think that's why I like triathlons, because the run's always at the end. It's like, okay, here's the cherry on top. And now I was told, this thing that you love, not only love, but like mitigated, was my, remediation for mental health was taken away. And so, but like I had all these tools and I was such a zealot of positive psych. I'm like, I can will myself out of this malaise, like I'll find my happy again. And the more I tried to chase that tiger by the tail, I was getting pretty close to a clinical disposition. But I like to pat myself on the back for being curious and explorer, and certainly, pick up wisdom when it's offered to me. And so I went down that rabbit hole to answer your question. Like, okay, if happiness is problematic, there's got to be something there, because there are a lot of folks living a joyful life that don't really seem to, succumb to some of the trappings of, these broader principles that we're talking about. One, just as an example, of folks are like, what's, Mike talking about? Like, I think a good example is the idea of finding three things to be grateful for a day. At first blush, for a subset of folks, it's probably a good idea, right? But it got. In fact, I don't think anyone can really figure out the exact roots of that exact number. Certainly, gratitude, we know, is a helpful tool. But why, like, all of a sudden, it became common wisdom, for life coaches to say, go find, three things to be grateful for. And in your neck of the woods, a researcher by the name of Sonia Lubomirsky found out that that can actually be a horrible thing for folks, similar to chasing happiness, right? If you're not in a situation like you did just lose a loved one, and someone says, well, go off and find three things to be grateful for, it actually, sets you in this mode of rumination where you're in a downward spiral, instead of, finding and creating the safe space to figure out, what it means that you are now in this immense amount of change. Like, spending your time trying to find three random things to be grateful for is not a good exercise, right? And so it's that type of course correction that became of interest. And so I really latched onto this idea of fun, which is, how can we enjoy our moments, even if our emotional disposition isn't meant to be, tell our friends, hey, yeah, life is, all puppy dogs and butterflies right now. Um, because there still needs to be a reprieve, right? Even if that in, our most challenging times is just a true escape from, what we're challenging. Not saying that we'll avoid it, right? Because there's nuances there, right? You can get in, bad spirals of escapism as well, but there's definitely healthy escapism where we can enjoy ourselves even when we're challenged. And the best part about it is that if we are in that period, where we need that, it starts to build upon itself, and it reminds us that there is, an amazing amount of good out there to find, enjoyable things, even though, the reality is there's a plethora of horrible things too that we're, always going to, could be potentially around the corner. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I love that you talked all about that because I feel like there's a swirling around that about positive mantras and being happy all the time. And I know for me, I'm generally a happy person anyway, but I do know when, if something has hit me, and I've even done episodes about cracking open, like something has cracked you open. that that could be sometimes the greatest place of healing. But I have tried to do the gratitude thing or the happiness thing when I'm being cracked open, and then I feel worse. I feel guilty because I'm not doing it right. And then there's that whole negation of the brain saying, "Oh, you're such a loser. You can't, why you're teaching this, but you can't even do it." Like that whole thing. So I'm so happy that you named that and you called that out because for me, I think it's really important that people see that from a psychology point of view, it is okay not to be okay. I've even talked about that. It's okay not to be okay. And sometimes it's great to dive into that and forget about the happiness and the gratitude until you can raise your vibration to a higher level. Well, it feels natural,
Yep,
right?
100%. At a more, sort of academic understanding of it, it's this idea of flexibility, right? We know
Yeah.
that if you live in that space where you think that's the way it's supposed to be, your life becomes quite fragile. So it might feel really good, for a very, whatever that episode is, hopefully it's long, but if you start to believe that's the only way and you're not ready for, for the things that are going to come at you, because we all age, right? So like at some point, there are going to be challenges that we're going to need to face, regardless of even if you live a privileged life. And so if you don't have that level of flexibility to be able to navigate that, that's when we know really bad things start to happen. And you also start to recede emotionally, right? I mean, life,
Mhm.
I believe, is supposed to be this tapestry. That's what makes it beautiful, right? We're not supposed to stay in one lane. And if we start to lose that ability, to maneuver around obstacles, then we run into them, quite frankly.
Yeah, I do too. So for me, I believe that as well, but also from a spiritual point of view, I have a very woo-woo mom, and so I've been taught that spirit came here to feel all the emotions. And like in Qigong, we say fear is not good or bad. It's simply emotion, but there could be too much. And so then it lodges the fear maybe in your kidneys and they become out of balance. But it's not bringing in gratitude and saying, okay, I'm healed now from this fear, but allowing the spirit to feel it. So I feel like, and then I like how you talk about, that's why the magic in the middle, because I like this, like how you talk about it, like it is a tapestry. And sometimes I almost like going into, like, I'll put on a I don't usually like chick flicks, but sometimes I'll put one on just because I just want to cry. Like, I want one of those good cry movies, like the new Sally Field movie with the octopus, just because it feels good to have that shower inside and go, oh, yeah, okay, I just did that. I'm human. I like the feeling of being human, Mike. So I love that you said that.
And it's interesting how that is a shared experience, whether you're secular or, have a spiritual slant. Like, to open up those pathways, right? To
Mhm.
allow other things to flow in because you've essentially gotten something stuck, and to be able to unearth it, uh, you know, seems like a pretty universal shared experience, even though it's, the narrative of it is, dependent on your worldview. So I'm right there with you. Oftentimes, I'll just like find that, like put on a sad song to do the exact same thing. And then it lets what you want back in. It's a very interesting phenomenon that again is real. It's not that isn't woo woo at all.
Yeah, and I feel like we give ourselves permission to be human. We're human, and I feel like that's been cut off. Like you're supposed to be this way all the time. No, we are human. We feel bad, we feel good. Some people have more of the extremes, but it's okay to be human. And I think it's really important to do that, to be human. Um, so let me see. Gosh, we've talked about so many things. I have my list of questions, so I always let the listeners know I have my list. I want to make sure we talk about everything because I have to tell the listeners this book is so rich with so many ideas with psychology, but also it's for every walk of life. It's for the parent, it's for the young person. Mike has really funny stories about And I want to say this early about being about being an Iron Man. I just can visualize you in your mohawk and your board shorts, doing the Iron Man competition, and you are officially an Iron Man. And the reason I bring this up is because of your personality. You are somebody who really seeks high arousal activities, right? Is what you call it. And so I want to talk about that because what you did, so part of the fun habit is taking things that can be really difficult, but putting this fun spin on it. And I don't know if I said that
No, that's
right.
right. Yeah.
And then starting in small bits and growing, which I think is important because we're talking about the nervous system. Oh, and the one thing I'll tell everybody, so we're supposed to have 2 hours of fun a day. I just want you to know that. And so if we just all of a sudden, it's like that New Year's resolution, I'm gonna have 2 hours of fun every day, and then you fall off and then you feel like crap. But you talk about even um starting small. So maybe we could talk about the Iron Man thing a little bit,
Yeah.
but relating it to all those millions of things I just said. So
No, and so, but I do want to give a tip of the hat. The 2 hour, um, a day comes from a colleague of mine out of UCLA, Dr. Cassie Holmes. So they did some work in that. So it's not just a sort of, grab a number out of the air. But it's really interesting you bring that up because this week, Real Simple magazine had reached out because there is, I guess, a survey that just came out where folks felt like the right amount of fun was 17 hours a week, but there was no way that was achievable. So I'm always careful about that number. Like, sure, do
Mhm.
you need something? And then also, like, I think we should build a container around that and say those 2 hours could be at work, right? A lot of us find ourselves in the sandwich generation. That's kind of what I was talking to Real Simple about. We're the most time impoverished generation ever. We're taking care of our kids and we're taking care of aging parents. So we do need to give ourselves some grace. So yeah, our number's interesting. If you're trying to design a life where you want to figure out the right inputs, yeah, you can hang on to that number. Uh, but going back to your question about the Ironman, something that's been self-gratifying since the book came out is this idea of how we've overemphasized this idea of everything needing to be done through fortitude and grit, and that we actually see that the folks that are the most successful are, even when they're doing hard things like an Ironman, are the ones that are finding out how to make components of it fun. And so for some, and there's, we have this concept in behavioral science called survivorship bias, where folks really find enjoyment in the suffering, right? And so we'll see those folks on ABC News, right? Because they're grinding it out and they're okay, uh, you know, giving it all away because that is something that's pleasurable for them and that's fine. But they are such the extreme, right? They're not good models for who we are. In fact, I'm so embarrassed that I'm blocking on her name right now, but here that won the gold that had
Mm. Alyssa Liu. Oh, Alyssa Liu.
essentially fired her whole team, including her father, because she had found that practice wasn't
Yeah.
enjoyable anymore. Yeah, the folks that, in my field of research, I mean, she was such a beacon of light for all of us because it's proof, right, that she did it, flexing her own agency and autonomy. She wasn't enjoying, the rigorous workouts. She knew she needed to work hard, but, the way it was being kind of prescribed for her wasn't enjoyable. So she quit. She didn't like the music she was picking. She certainly didn't like, this need to capitulate to the appearance of what a normal figure skater looks like. So she reinvented the game and did it through fun. And look at the outcome. And so, but we usually don't champion folks like her. So I'm glad we're getting a chance to talk about her, right? And it's the same way I organized the Ironman. I wanted to complete it, right? So I set the bar that I wanted, which still puts me in the top, 1%, but it ran against the grain of what every other Ironman was there to do, which was to try and get the best time possible, right? And so I knew that I'd also need to make a lot of noise because I am someone that has high affinity needs and needs high arousal. So instead of wearing, kind of form fitting biking and running gear, I did wear Hawaiian board shorts. And I'm never the type of guy that would get a mohawk. I tend to work at a desk, but yet, and it's a nod to my, now he's a bit of a firebrand, but back then P. Diddy wasn't as problematic as he is now. And he had just gotten a mohawk to run the New York Marathon. So it was, I did steal the idea from him, but it like was something that was boisterous and loud. And as I said in the book, it worked. There were a couple of Kiwi families that I now don't keep in touch with, but for over a decade did. They were like, who is this guy? And they followed me around. And I kind of, in real time, acquired this like really interesting fan base just because I made the whole thing into a spectacle and did it my way. And so, now it's a memory that I'll never forget. And also because it was enjoyable, I was able to do the work, right? Instead of, you know, one of the things that I often lampoon is this idea of 75 hard. Again, I think it's another amazing example of survivorship bias. And for folks that don't know what 75 hard is, was a social media trend where you did all of these ridiculous things for 75 days. And if you fell off the wagon for one of them, you were supposed to start all over again. And so was it interesting to talk about? Sure. But like if you peel back the amount of moral injury it did because of the folks that just couldn't abide to something that stringent, right? It's like ultimately just not that helpful. And so spinning the conversation back to how can we create these things so folks can do amazing stuff like win a gold medal in figure skating or an Ironman when they had no business at 220 pounds, even
Yeah.
doing an Ironman in the first place. And then, live to tell the tale and say I had fun the whole time, you know?
Yeah. And it sounded like it that you had fun. And I just want to highlight to people, yeah, you were not in shape when you started doing the Ironman, 220 pounds, and you just started and made it fun and succeeded. And the other part I like about it is that it was your mom and dad and your girlfriend at the time, but your wife now were at the finish line, right? And
Yeah.
the Kiwis were cheering you on. And so the community that built, which to me I feel like is really important, is community around your fun habit.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's three elements that are important, and it's the activities that you're doing, right? And so, real quickly, I think it's that connection that you have with it. So many of us oftentimes will just allow happenstance or habituated life to, where we just kind of go along with what others like instead of taking one
Hmm.
step back. And is this something that at the end of the day I really want to do? It's the environment that we're in. I know you love gardening, right? And so like being in that space is just magical. People are rediscovering nature, and we now know how restorative that can be. And then even during COVID, right? Like, at
Hmm.
first we were happy working from home, but then there were a subset of folks that like were starting to just hate being that confined and found interesting ways to mitigate that. But to loop back to your original point, the people that we're doing it with make all the difference. And yeah, so who is your tribe? Who is your community? And even for introverts, right, that doesn't mean that you need to spend a lot of time with them, but to be able to share those memories. I don't work with her anymore, but at the time, and we worked together for years, but I do, talk about her in the book. The person that was helping me edit my blog, Haley, is a staunch introvert. So when she first read the first edition of the book, she was like, this is still so much through your lens, and we don't need another self-help book that's like, hey, look at me, do all these, crazy big things. She's like, could we, have at least some, for introverts? And so, I forget again if I talked about it in the book or if we talked about it on my website, but she just makes play dates with her friends. They're very, contained. There are only a few people, folks that are really, meaningful to her in her life. They organize what they want to do, and then they give themselves space at night so that they can recoup their energy. But those opportunities are still so much more meaningful, right, than if they were a solo activity because they're still getting to spend time with one another. And then, even the relationship with you that you have with the activity itself, as in the book, from an ethnographic, I'm going to from dancers. We won't go with the fancy academic word. Uh, this love affair that I talk about with the craft, and so the relationship doesn't have to be with another person, but that relationship is important because if it's an I proposition, right? If it's a look at me, I'm doing this for external validation, or at its worst, for likes and comments, like we just know that doesn't fill you up. But if you feel a connection to it, and at the end of the day, if no one knew that you did it except you know the thing that you're engaged with, or that group of people that really matter, then it's going to sustain you. It's going to fill that fun cup, and make you realize that life is worth living.
Yeah, yeah. And you do talk about taking little steps for the introverts. I loved that chapter. That I think that's really important. Yeah, go Haley. And go Mike, because you've hit it is really good. So I want to get into, could we talk about the four quadrants, which are pleasing, living, agonizing, yielding, and could you walk us through them? I think some of our listeners are about to realize with a gasp how much their week is spent in the bottom two, which has been me, unfortunately. But this book helped me to realize that. That's why I love reading. But this book helped me to realize that. And I actually had a little story last week. I was just in this funk. I don't know what the heck happened. I went to the Netflix void, which I watch positive, uplifting things. I can't watch violent things and stuff. Um, but I just could not pull myself out of this funk. And then, of course, the fun habit, Mike in my ear, because you narrate it, which I love. You're such a great narrator. In my ear, and I'm like, I don't think I'm having enough fun. I think I'm living in the bottom quadrant. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. My energy was low, and I'm typically very high energy inspired. I get downloads all the time, so maybe too many, and I'm like, how am I going to do all this? But it's exciting. Like I get excited. And so I want to talk about these quadrants just quickly and what they are.
Yeah, of course. So, for context, for anyone listening, uh, generally anyone that does the type of work I do, we have you look at some form of how you're spending your time. There's 168 hours in a week, so that's generally the container that we have. Um, and especially again, this idea of time poverty, right? Like if we're living a life that just seems like Groundhog's Day, peeling that back and understanding why is the first step. Because the last thing we want to do is, you know, make fun a prescription on top of an already over-indexed schedule. That's as toxic as some of the other things that we've talked about. In fact, it's going to send you in the wrong direction. So the play model is a way to look at each one of those hours in context. Yeah, so you already said the acronym. PLAY is the acronym. It stands for pleasing, living, agonizing, and yielding. And pleasing activities are things that don't require a lot of effort, but that do fill us up. But what we found is a lot of times we're not doing those things, especially not deliberately. Even if we're doing things that we might enjoy, if we're doing them through the lens of I have to do that instead of I get to do this, which can make all the difference, then we don't register it as fun. Again, if it's become routine and we're not adding elements that it's going to encode any new memories, like, oh, yeah, I remember doing this, or, this was funny, or I enjoyed the company of my coworker, or whatever it is, then when you look back, at the week behind you, it's just going to seem like it passed you by. So it's adding elements to the things that you're doing that you're like, yeah, you know what, this hour was enjoyable because of X, Y, and Z, but it's not really requiring any extra energy. The living quadrant are things that do require some effort, but really do light us up. And the reason that it's important to look at that in context, especially in a busy life, that generally is where growth lives, right? Pleasing activities are important because we know, again, if we're kind of just mind wandering the whole day, that generally it's a low level of malaise, and we're going to say that we didn't enjoy the day. But if you don't find anything that's stretching you in that 168, it's really just an invitation to figure out, what is it that I could bring in? And it doesn't have to be like a Spartan race or an Ironman race or whatever it is. It could be like meditation, right? Which is cognitively very hard, or a spiritual practice, if that's something, that you're, something that would light you up, or whatever it is, reading, a really heady book, or, going on, a really strenuous hike, but just something that where you feel like it would lead to growth in some area of life is important. And so looking for those things to just make sure your life's not devoid of it's important. But the other two, as you mentioned, are the most insidious and what we're really trying to do in this initial step. Agonizing are the things that are hard that we just don't want to do. And when we don't think about it, oftentimes we don't realize that a lot of those things are things that we probably could either better our circumstance or engineer out. I know one of the examples that you like from the book in our pre-interview was for my wife and I, it was bathing our kids. It was just tough for about a year's worth of time. And at the time, and still now, quite frankly, we couldn't afford a full-time nanny. And which was like really the only, I think, socially acceptable sort of concept, of someone that could do that kind of childcare. And so again, we just peeled back that, like, is that really true? I mean, if you got a fractional nanny, you would just call them a babysitter. Why couldn't they do something like that? This is just not fun for the four of us. The more we tried to like make it fun, the worse it was getting. We tried.
Yeah.
I think it completely collapsed when we thought, oh, maybe if we put them in together, at the same time, they could play with each other, and that just I think was what broke our back, quite frankly. Um, so we ended up hiring someone to do it, a babysitter that was willing to do it, and it was amazing. She was like the super fun person. I think just taking us out of this agonizing activity, just like you change the script just because it was a pattern interrupt. But not only that, we bought back a little bit of our time, and now we were able to have dinner with each other, twice a week. And because they were so young, that was something that just hadn't been happening. So we were able to reconnect and talk, the way that we used to. And we don't need to do that anymore because our kids are older. But it's just a good example of something that you take for granted as being immutable, and how can you change it. And so if even hiring a babysitter is too much of a lift, could you swap that? Could you do like a timeshare babysitting swap with a neighbor, or whatever it is? So is there opportunities to kind of change your circumstance in that, or are there ways to add elements to it so that it's more enjoyable? Often, one of the things that's commonly talked about is like if you really hate a certain chore, but it doesn't require a lot of cognitive work, it's just it's agonizing because you've done it for so long and it's so boring. Could you throw on your favorite podcast and just and really focus on the podcast? There's some amazing research from Katie Milkman in this area around exercise, where it was folks that didn't necessarily like exercising, but identified of really, really liking certain podcasts. So all she asked them to do was make the social agreement that you can't listen to your favorite podcast until you go to the gym. When you go into the gym, you're allowed to listen to it. And if you've listened this long to us, it should be no surprise that they started to not necessarily like fitness more, but forget that they didn't like it, liked the podcast more because now they were limiting their ability to listen to this thing, right? Because if we really like something but do it too much, it can fall out of favor. So they like the podcast more. And then the result, again, going back to using fun to do hard things, they were working out more. So it's like a win-win-win-win, right? And so that's the opportunity of exposing agonizing things on your schedule. And then the most insidious, but I think the most well understood, is yielding. So many of us displace. You just talked about it with Netflix, right? We have a really bad week, and we kid ourselves by alleviating that non-fun state was something that is really just passive and displaces that discomfort or frustration or whatever you're facing, which is fine. Again, if it's just 1 week, you had a bad week, you watch a little Netflix, who cares, right? But it's when it becomes habitual, and we find ourselves in a downward spiral, as you know, and this is going to be the only geeky thing I'll bring up in the podcast, but there's some real science behind this. It's called the hedonic flexibility principle. And what we
Hmm.
know is that folks that get in that cycle, it just gets worse and worse, right? Because what you do is you're not really, finding a way to recharge your batteries. You're really just displacing that discomfort. But oftentimes that can lead to like poor sleep, or habitual or more addictive behavior, because all of these things built in the attention economy really were designed to hijack our attention. So, right, like scrolling, to get yourself sleepy, all of a sudden it's 1 a.m. You don't know where the time went. But if I asked you if you enjoyed that, you certainly wouldn't say yes. So now you have poor sleep. You show up the next day, you're more burnt out, so you feel worse. So, and the cycle continues. But what we found was, in doing these types of studies, the marquee study that I cite in the book that's really well done, Stanford, MIT, and Oxford, I believe, 20,000 participants. So it's not like, one of these weird studies, it's 12 people and you make this big, sort of assertion from it. Um, they went out to ask, like, are we truly pleasure seeking animals? This philosophical idea of, we're either always trying to chase pleasure or escape pain. So we've already, kind of talked about, yeah, it does look like we try to escape pain. No one wants to live in pain habitually. But the big surprising finding was the folks that felt like their fun cup was full, that were integrating all the things that we talked about by deliberate design, were the ones that were actually, ironically, the most productive, because they don't seek out more fun. Once they feel that they're fulfilled, they actually go seek out growth. And they also understand transition rituals, right? So they know that, there's certain times, within their day that they need to spin down so they can show up the next day as the best version of themselves. So yielding is really is why it's important. It's that kind of passive. It doesn't take much energy, but it doesn't fill us up, and so it just grows. Right? It becomes an insidious amount um, in your week. So much so that that's why all major smartphone manufacturers have had to put health elements in it, because if they didn't, that would have gotten legislated anyways. I mean, behavioral science is so clear of how much time we don't realize we're spending on our phones. So for most people, unless they're pretty self-aware of their habits, when they look at that health meter, either on their iPhone or their Android, and realize how much time, sometimes it's not social media, but it could be, in their email app or, their Slack app, things that, where they don't need to be spending 18 hours, 19 hours. And so these folks will be like, I just don't have time for fun. Oh, really? But you have 14 hours for Facebook,
How long were you on Instagram?
Yeah.
Um, so right now, our world is experiencing a lot of change, up and downs, a lot of transition. Um, and it is a very scary, unstable time. I see my community, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of also in the world, a lot of hatred and anxiety. So, is it okay for us to give ourselves permission to have fun right now? And is this a good idea?
I mean, I think we need to survive, right? I mean, the idea behind this is social contagion. We need to set that example for others. And certainly, if you're living in despair, then everything else is going to seem like it's that much darker. And so, I mean, Frankel talked about this in the worst of times at a concentration camp, right? I mean, being
Mm.
able to find elements that are hopefully in shared humanity, but at least connect us to something bigger than ourselves. Again, whether that's, the reason to live, or the fact that, people are good. I believe that fun is an amazing social glue for those types of connections. And so, to say that we shouldn't have fun because life is challenging right now, at the most basic scientific level would put us all in the trappings of that hedonic flexibility principle, where we're just going to continue down a downward spiral. And we know that when we are in this, you know, place where we feel safer, we can make better decisions. We want to contribute more. We want to sort of approach things with curiosity and from a nonlinear fashion, which is where better solutions tend to arise, anyways. Um, and this is a little bit out of my academic sphere of influence, but certainly, and I think you've alluded to having an interest in this, we know that the ability to calm down our nervous systems too, and collectively get out of fight or flight will alleviate some of this, and so we might not necessarily feel safe, but we won't have the physiological trappings that are, that can really be insidious if we keep ourselves in that space for the whole 168 hours. So when someone's like, okay, that's great, because you're kind of talking about it conceptually, like what can we do? There's an interesting tool in psychology, where if that's something that you do feel like I need to give some attention, and I think most of us do, create that space, that agreement with you that I will think about this. I'll doom scroll for an hour and a half, 2 hours during this period so that I can feel like I'm up to date. If I feel like there's any action I need to take, I can put that into my schedule. But at the end of those 2 hours, then I'm done for that week. And I'll come back to it. So it's not like I'm, an ostrich putting my head in, but I'm preserving a certain amount of time. So like other things, it doesn't become insidious. Because if we can't take action, right, it reminds us that, well, it doesn't remind us, quite frankly, it subjectively makes us feel like we're helpless, and
Mm-hmm.
we're not, right? We can always contribute to something. And so, as you know, I talk about that, that even the most staunch, uh, game changers, the folks that are making these huge ripples, um, preserve time for fun because they know if they don't, they can't play the long game. And there are, examples abound of folks that really burnt out super quickly because if everything is bad, right, we just, as a being, um, we can't operate in that space for very long. So even if you're someone that feels challenged by the heaviness of everything, creating moments where you at least enjoy some moments of your week is going to give you that scaffolding and energy to then go fight the battle, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
in that context, to answer your question specifically, it's probably more important now than ever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too. Um, And then, so my last question, and so this is the heart of the magic in the middle, is about the liminal space where science and spirit meet. So the place where what we know from research and what we feel in our soul confirm each other. So where do you find your magic in the middle, Mike?
Well, as I allude in the book, I think it's the mystery. I've
Mhm.
never been, an atheist by any stretch, right? But I think I've been to some degree because I'm critical and I need the information first. That's been a limiter with regards to access to what in the book I call the mystery. And so now, um, I just let that in, and it's a really neat space. And the neatest part about it is, it's a really opportune time, right? I think when move, so I was quite moved. I think kind of the kernel of it was what the Bleep Do We Know first came out, you
Mhm.
know. But there, because I was an interesting dissection of the beginning of an understanding of quantum mechanics, and then folks that, in my opinion, were a bit charlatans about it because we didn't know enough, and so they just kind of made major leaps, and bent it to, ideologies that were more, uh, I think, creative than scientific. But now this idea that, no matter what the source is, that, and you kind of alluded to it at the beginning of our conversation, that we're all just fractals of it, kind of trying to figure it out itself. Um, I think is the middle for me. This understanding that, um, that we're here for a reason, as trite as it is, that kind of saying that we're, uh, you know, not humans having a spiritual experience, but, spirits having a human experience. Did I get that right? Right? Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think there's some truth to that, because even if it's just something where you want to park your faith, and even if you're secular like me, it still allows you in a way that's mysterious and gives you access to wonder, to be curious. It was weird. Like my editor tried to cut it out because the quote like took up 2 pages, but kind of the second milestone for me was when I interviewed Lisa Feldman Barrett. If you recall, she's a popular neuroscientist that has a bunch of books of her own, and I think our worldviews are somewhat similar, but she was like, just think about the immense amount of information that we don't know. And when you ponder that, right, all of like the fact that computers are just getting smaller and smaller, the fact that we understand the universe is probably bigger than we once thought, all the mysteries of how traditional physics, Newtonian physics, don't really mesh with what we are learning scientifically. That things just kind of come in and out of existence, and we can't explain that. That how small that makes us, and that's a good thing, because if we're small, then all these things that we think are these big deals, these big weights in the world, are our own personal problems, then shrink with that, because as we're shrinking, you know, kind of where we fit, and we understand it's a much bigger picture, then the things that we're deeming are important right now are probably a little bit more insignificant than we made them out to be. And I just think that's a more beautiful way to exist. So that's my middle.
I love that. I do too. I do too. And Mike, I'm so thankful you're here. I'm so thankful that we reconnected. You're a recovering screenwriter. But I want to, so for people to find you, they will go to your website, michaelrucker.com, right? And I'll have it in the show notes. And then I thought it'd be fun for people to explore the fun type calculator. Um, and then your website too, I'm gonna go back to that because it is a fun website and so I do suggest to go to his website. There's a lot of great information. And the Fun Habit book, I mean, really, it's so good. There's so much science, like we were talking about. And then experiences. Mike has great stories. It's funny, made me, sad and cry and just all the different things. So, and you narrate it. And so I just really felt the heart that you brought to to the
Oh,
book.
thank you so much. That's very kind.
Yeah, yeah. So thank you, Mike. And we'll talk to you later. And thanks everybody for joining us on the Magic in the Middle. It's always a pleasure to have everybody here. And I don't take for granted that you are joining us on the Magic in the Middle. And I invite you to share with friends and family if you feel like this is valuable and it's supporting you, and giving a thumbs up. And please connect with me too. I love it when you connect with me. So we'll talk to you next time. I was gonna say see you, but we'll talk to you next time.